I'm just curious. I'd like to know if people have read the book or not, only because I can approach it a little differently depending upon if there are some who have not read it.
I'm Kristen. I have not read the book. I watched the documentary Seduced on Stars, and so I started getting obsessed with little things, and this came up in my calendar.
Okay, all right. So that's great. So at least I know if not everybody has read it, I can tell a little bit about the story. Um, so in essence, Eric told you that I was born in Cambridge in 1948, and I really grew up in a what I for years called uh, a religious community. I thought of it, frankly, as a commune of sorts. And it only came to me as I was writing the book. Now, and I shouldn't even be that bold. It was brought to my attention by my daughter while I was writing the book. So this is only 4 or 5 years ago. And she said to me, "Mom, I have something to tell you." She said, "You have to accept the fact that you grew up in a cult." And I never, ever, ever thought of where I grew up as a kid. I thought of it only as my home. It was a place I loved. It was a bizarre and unusual upbringing. But to me, a cult was Jim Jones. A cult was the Branch Davidians. And I didn't see my own home as a cult. So in the book, the word cult never is mentioned. All that being said, I took to heart what she said, and I am completely, not only convinced, completely aware of the fact that it really was. It morphed into a cult, and it didn't start off that way, and I think that's important to share with you. So the history starts way back in 1940, when a Catholic woman, Catherine Clark, set up a club for Catholic students at Harvard and Radcliffe. And the idea was this was a place for them to socialize. She had tea for them every afternoon. And it was also a place for them to talk about religious things. And it became so popular that in 1943, she asked the then Archbishop of Boston, Richard Cushing, if he would allow a chaplain to be installed. And the chaplain she wanted was a Jesuit priest, very well known, renowned poet, writer, humorist, named Leonard Feeney. And he came on board in 1943 to be the chaplain. As you know, this was right during the middle of the war. And at the end of the war, of course, there was the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And there was something that happened in that environment where Leonard Feeney, renowned Catholic priest, took a very harsh view towards what he called liberalism in the United States. Liberalism, as he saw it, being taught in Catholic universities and colleges like Boston College, which was a Jesuit school where he taught, and Holy Cross College, as well as secular colleges, Harvard and Radcliffe. And right after the war, my father came back from having fought the entire war aboard the USS Enterprise. He had gone to undergraduate school at Bates College in Maine and was a teacher, and then went into the Navy. And he came out and was on the GI Bill, was getting his graduate degree at Boston College in philosophy. And he was introduced by his professor to this place, this club that was known as St. Benedict Center. And he was a young bachelor, 29 years old, and found the place very, very inspiring intellectually. And then one day in 1947, he was there, and in walked this young woman who was only 18 years old, and she was a freshman at Boston University. And I'm going to now share my screen. So at any rate, he met this beautiful young woman who was 18 years old, who grew up right in the shadow of Harvard Yard. She grew up on Ellery Street in Cambridge. And she had been brought up Episcopalian, and she was being brought to Father Leonard Feeney because she was about to become Catholic. And she had known for many years she wanted to become Catholic. So that was March of 1947. My father, who was still in his naval uniform, well, he probably was just out of it, met her. They were engaged 3 months later. They were married 6 months from the day they met, and 11 months after that, I was born. My father was then teaching as well as getting his graduate degree. So he was teaching mathematics first, and then in 1948, he was offered the position to teach philosophy as well as mathematics. This is to undergraduates while he's getting his graduate degree. And all of this is happening while Father Feeney is lambasting the liberal, faculties and espousing a very doctrinaire version of the dogma of the Catholic Church, which says you have to be Catholic to get to heaven. And my parents, my mother having just been a convert, my father, who knows exactly why, but having come through the war and seeing some true horrors, aligned completely with Father Feeney. But the interesting thing was that the Archbishop, who would later become Cardinal Cushing, the Archbishop of Boston said, please do not push that dogma of the church. We're trying to become more ecumenical. But the fact of the matter is, Father Feeney said, absolutely not. This is the way I will preach it. And my parents were totally supportive with him. So this place, St. Benedict Center, that had been hugely, hugely popular, started to dwindle because many of the students left. They were not interested in following that stringent an interpretation of the dogma of no salvation outside the Catholic Church. And so in late 1948, when I was just an infant, the Archbishop basically told Leonard Feeney that he could not practice as a priest in the Diocese of Boston starting in January of 1949. And furthermore, his provincial, the Jesuit provincial, said, and you need to leave St. Benedict Center and go out and teach English at Holy Cross College. He refused. So in January of 1949, there was a small group of adults, about 52 of them, and they created a religious order. Admittedly, many of them were married. They signed on to a religious order, the mission of which was to defend the dogma that there was no salvation outside the Catholic Church. And in that signing, they promised, they took a vow to obey Leonard Feeney. And from my standpoint, that vow was something that was ultimately what would cause the huge disruption, not only in the organization, but also in my family. So I'll show you a couple of fun pictures. There's Father Feeney at my parents' wedding. And then there is my father right there next to Leonard Feeney, and the other professors. On the back, on the left, Charlie Awaskio, who was a PhD in physics. On the right, Fakhri Malouf, who came from Lebanon and emigrated to the United States, and he was a professor of philosophy. These were all at Boston College. And then in the front, David Suppel, whose father was a renowned surgeon in Boston, and he taught German at Boston College High School. And in the spring, 3 months after this group, including all of those there, became this religious order called the Slaves of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Those the three professors and David Suppel were fired from Boston College. And the following week, this was right around Easter, and on Easter Monday, Father Feeney was officially silenced, which meant he could no longer practice as a priest. So now this small community of 50 odd people with about 4 or 5 children, I was about 7 or 8 months old at that time, banded together. My father was now without a job. Fakhri and my father and Charlie Awaskio, each of them had bought a house. My father bought his on the GI Bill. And the 2 other professors gave their houses to the center. My parents, whose house was not right in Harvard Square, they sold their house and gave all the proceeds to the center. And de facto, this community now became a commune of sorts, which was the way I thought of it. Well, I was a tiny little child at the time, and over the next 5 or 6 years, what were about 4 or 5 children turned into 39 children. So there was now a community of about 100 people. And there were changes that started to take place very early on. So here's a picture of my parents with me. I'm the oldest child there, my sister Kathy on the right, and my brother David, who's an infant. But you can see that my mother is dressed almost in a religious garb. She's there with this hat on her head and a black coat. My father's got a black suit with a little medal. And they continued to live as a married couple, and they would end up having 2 more children. But shortly thereafter, Father Feeney changed the names of everyone. And so I had called my parents Mommy and Daddy, and all of a sudden I now had to speak to my mother, addressing her as Sister Elizabeth Ann, and my father as Brother James Aloysius. But we still had relationships with families. And so there is my father when my brother's just a year old. So that's 1952. Some of you may be familiar with this bridge right in Cambridge that crosses the Charles River. And there I am at the age of 4 with my grandmother, whom I absolutely adored, my father's mother. By 1953, this picture was taken. So you can see there's the entire community. We lived in a cluster of 7 houses in Cambridge, and you can see out to the left there, behind the tall man on the left, see that fence. We had a fence that was built that surrounded all 7 houses, and it basically shut us out from the rest of the world. You can see Father Feeney in the middle, in the first row of men. Sister Catherine is that red-headed woman sitting in the front. My mother is in the front row, the 4th from the right. I should probably have a little light to identify her. I would say she's the prettiest one there. And way up in the back row, the farthest to the right, is my father. And I remember this picture being taken. It's actually before all of the babies were born. And I can tell, I figured out exactly when this was, because I could see which of the women, who were now called big sisters, and the men were called big brothers, and the children little sisters and little brothers, which is why my book is entitled Little Sisters. But I can see that some of them are wearing the outfits that they wore when they were pregnant. At any rate, by when I turned 6, so just shortly after this picture was taken, 3 months after I turned 6, there was one monumental change that took place. And now Catherine Clark was called Sister Catherine. Father and Sister Catherine made the decision that all the children who were 3 years of age and older would no longer live with their parents. So I was 6, my sister Kathy was 4, and my brother David was 3. And we were separated from our parents. And we lived communally with the other little sisters on one floor, little brothers on the other, that were 3 years and older. And that was the real start of the breakup of the families. Then none of the adults were allowed to contact any of their family outside in the world. And by now, at 6 years old, I was really aware that we were very different. On the other hand, until that happened, this picture that you're looking at is what I called my aunts and uncles. You know, there were my parents, and then there were all of these adults who were highly educated, intelligent, fun-loving, and I thought of them as my whole family. And it was only when things started to really deteriorate, specifically by breaking up the family, that I could see the dark side. The interesting thing is, shortly after that, Father Feeney put great pressure on the parents, the 12 couples that were married, to take vows of celibacy. My parents did not want to. And eventually Father Feeney said to them, "You're the only ones not doing it." And so they talked to each other and they said, well, if this is best for our children's upbringing and to make sure that they're brought up good Catholics, we will do it. Well, later, many years later, we found out that Father Feeney had used that same tactic with many of the other adults. So this is a picture of Sister Catherine and her husband, Hank. So she forced vows of celibacy on everyone. And in 1958, we moved from Cambridge up to the town of Harvard, Massachusetts, a little hamlet within the town called Still River, to 18 acres of beautiful farmland. And that's when the true separation started, or continued. All of a sudden, we were not even allowed to speak to our parents anymore. And the rules that were embedded in our daily life were really almost monastic. There was silence. We were not allowed to speak during meals. We had 2 times of recreation. We went to Mass every morning, benediction every night. And Sister Catherine selected 8 of the big sisters, whom she called angels, and they were the ones she put in charge of raising the 39 children. She herself was an extraordinary disciplinarian, and she created something that she called the Big Punisher, which was a piece of rubber hose, garden hose, 2.5 to 3 feet long, that was used as, the means of punishment. And it was used, frequently every single day. Not on every child, but there were some children that could barely go a day without being beaten by it. This woman, Sister Catherine, would go home to her house in Waltham 3 evenings a week, and that was her husband, who was a lovely man, but unlike all the other families, she went home to spend time with her husband. That being said, as I write in my book, my mother told me once that Sister Catherine said to my mother that her wedding night was the worst night of her life, and she asked her husband to take a vow of celibacy with her together, which she did agree to do, though very reluctantly, and they adopted 2 children. So my mother has always argued that there was some serious flaw in Sister Catherine that had to do with some intense distaste for sex, if you want to just leave it at that. So once we moved out to Still River, you can see this picture was taken in 1963 on the far left, but you can see we were very much wear our hair the same way, wore identical clothes. There was absolutely nothing that gave one any indication of whether we were pretty or not pretty. You can see that our clothes are pretty formless, and we were all being very, very, very much geared and trained to migrate, if you will, from being little sisters to big sisters. And by the time I was around 1962 or 3, and I was 13, 14, going on 15 years old, I was very anxious because there was nothing in me that wanted to be a nun for the rest of my life. I would have my daydreams of being, escorted off by a prince and living in a castle and having lots of children. And so I was very fearful of this life that was of necessity unfolding ahead of me. And this is a picture of the little boys at that same time. So there were 19 boys and 20 girls. This picture was in 1965. This is with my siblings. There was a lawsuit that came. One of the big brothers decided that he didn't want to live this life. And he went to his wife and said, "Will you leave with me and we'll take our 5 sons out and I will go back to college and get my law degree and make a home and a living for you?" And she said no. So he ended up suing for custody of his 5 children. And he won that custody. And in that process, there were pictures taken of the family. So this is I'm in the left on the back there. My sister Peggy is in the front, my brother, my sister Kathy, and my baby sister Ronnie. This was around 1965. This is an interesting picture. So there are my parents. Very seldom would they end up being together, but this must have been a cookout or a picnic, and somebody took a picture of the two of them. So that is the way I saw them. That was the way they seemed to me throughout my childhood. So here's just a picture of, I must say, and for those of you who might think I'm telling you a horror tale, the life up in Still River was really wonderful. I have some wonderful memories. And when I decided to write my book, I said to my parents, I was 55 at the time, and I said, I look back on my childhood with a lot of pleasure. And in fact, I really did. We had ponies, we had horses, we did horseback riding, we swam, we worked very hard. This was a working farm. We had several hundred chickens. You have 100 people, you have a lot to do to support them. But the fact of the matter is, once the rules are established, you have to learn to enjoy life around them. And I really did. And so I thought this was kind of just a fun picture. This is a picture of my father shortly around the time that I was about to be kicked out. He was always reading, and this is the way I thought of him and saw him, always dressed in his cassock. But I will tell you, there was something extremely wonderful about him. He would break the rules. Sometimes the way he broke the rule was just wiggling his little finger at me, which was his way of saying hello, because he wasn't allowed to speak to me. And I must say that occasionally, when Sister Catherine wasn't around, he would whisper, how's my little princess? And he had 4 daughters and 1 son, and he had the same expression for all 4 of us girls. How's my little princess? And he did that with all of us. And I do think that in large measure, the reason I have not been broken by what happened was always knowing that my parents loved me. And the dedication of my book is to my parents for always letting me know that they loved me. We did have a band. I'm just kind of showing you a little bit of our life. And then, okay, well, I think I'll take that one off for a moment. So around this time, you can see we're definitely teenagers at this point. And when I was a senior in high school, well, by the time I was 14 or 15, I started having crushes. And the boys were mostly younger than I was, so there wasn't much interest in them. So the only real interest I could have was in some of the grown men. But it was the most chaste crush in the world. I knew nothing about procreation. It was not told to us because, for all intents and purposes, why did we need to know? We were going to be the bride of Christ. We didn't need to know what it was like to be someone's bride and to have a married life, etc., etc. So all I knew is that I was just infatuated with one of the big brothers, and Sister Catherine was excoriate me over and over again. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how she could tell, but I think we all know, for those of us who have daughters. I mean, I remember when my daughter was 11 or 12 and she had a crush on someone, and boy, there was nothing she could do to hide it. So whatever I thought I was able to hide, Sister Catherine could see through. And finally, one day when I was 17 years old, I was a senior in high school. She called me into her office, and my mother was there. My mother was I'd never been in Sister Catherine's office with my mother there. And she basically told me that in the sweetest tones, that not everyone has a vocation to be a nun. But in essence, what she was telling me, which took me a few moments to figure out, was that she was kicking me out. And here I was, a senior in high school. I thought I was going to be kicked out that night, and she told me I could stay till I graduated. Because we had the lawsuit, we had been challenged. The local authorities had challenged that perhaps the school was not up to par. And so I was asked to apply to two colleges. One was Bates, where my father had gone, and one was Vassar. I got into both of those schools, which was what the center needed and what ultimately allowed it to receive its accreditation. But then I was forced to write a response to the admissions office at both places saying that I would not be coming. So there I was, I found myself on my graduation day. Oops, I guess I excluded that picture. But on my graduation day, literally 2 hours after I graduated, I was driven away, driven off the property, not allowed to say goodbye to anyone. And so my siblings didn't even know that I was going to be gone. My father took me. I spent the summer with his sister, my aunt, and in the end of the summer, and I did see my parents. They came and spent time with me. But they were still very much Brother James Aloysius and Sister Elizabeth Ann. And I was now out in the world. And in September, Sister Catherine allowed as how she would spend whatever the cost was to send me to secretarial school. And so for 9 months, I went to secretarial school in Boston, coming back each night to Still River, but not being allowed to be on the property, staying in a separate house that was, off the main part of the property. My mother would be there with me as Sister Elizabeth Ann. We would chat. We would have dinner together. My father would drive me to the bus. The moment I got my secretarial certificate, that was it. I got a job at $2 an hour, and there was no opportunity to go back to Still River, to my home, to see my family or anything. And I took a room at the YWCA in Boston. And it was a cubicle of a room, but it was my first apartment, and there was a communal bathroom down the hallway, and that was my start. 2 years after Sister Catherine kicked me out, she died. She was 67 years old, obviously a premature death. But moments after she died, a lot of infighting started, not too surprisingly, particularly in a place that I have now come to accept was a cult. And the infighting was between the big brothers, the big sisters. It was over money, it was over power. And it was then that the children told their parents about the beatings that had taken place. And then the parents rose up with the children. And by 1969, my father and my mother left, and with two of my siblings. And by 1971, my other two siblings, two sisters who had become nuns for a period of time, left. And so this is a picture of the family all reunited. And this is in 1972. And we're celebrating our parents' 25th wedding anniversary. So that was a pretty quick migration back from being Sister Elizabeth Ann and Brother James Aloysius to actually being Betsy and Jim Walsh again. So that was kind of the PowerPoint presentation I had that kind of takes you full circle. For myself, I started to go to college at night, and it took me 9 years, but I graduated with a degree in economics, which Eric had mentioned, from Boston University. And in January of 1975, I ended up moving to New York. The first job that I had was as a receptionist at a brokerage firm. And it is for that reason and that reason alone that I ended up with a career on Wall Street. I started off as the receptionist and just, had steps moving forward little by little, and ended up having an absolutely wonderful career. I think it's really important for me to share with you that this is not a Mommy Dearest story, and I think the way I've told it doesn't sound like a Mommy Dearest story. It's really, for me, it's a love story. It's a story about a family that couldn't be broken. And my mother read the entire book. She died only 2 years ago. She was just a couple of months shy of her 90th birthday. And she said, parts of it make me sad, but she said, it's all true and you need to publish it. So and my father had died earlier. He was 12 years older than my mother. But he had been very supportive of the idea of my writing it. So I feel very good that the book, I feel, has the blessing of my parents. I think I should tell you that the center eventually reconciled with the Catholic Church. And so up in Still River today, the house that was the main house is a Benedictine monastery. Literally only 2 or 3 of the original big brothers and sisters are now alive. Of the 39 children, only 2 have remained in religious life. So most of all the rest of the children have gone off and gotten married, had children, and most of them now have grandchildren. I must say that when I was publishing the book, it came out 18 months ago, I was anxious that the other children might not be happy with the book. And I tried very hard to tell only my own story. But that story is 85% the same story that everybody else had. But I took out stories that were about other children, except for my sister Kathy, because she is so intertwined with my own situation. And what has amazed me, what has been really for me a blessing, I think, is to have had so many of the children reach out to me and say, thank you for writing the book. In one case, someone had just lost all contact with all of us. And she reached out to me, and she and I now talk at least once a week. So that has made me feel really good, because what I discovered afterwards was that many of the children have suffered from PTSD. And some have been in therapy for 10, 20, 30, 40 years since they left. So I think it was, in a way, a grace to have written the book. It's made me a little bit addicted to writing now, so I'm actually writing a second book, which is about my Wall Street life, which is going to be much more upbeat, much more fun, but zany. I was very young when I started, but the fact of the matter is there were no women in professional life on Wall Street, or very, very, very few. So I had some wonderful mentors, and they were all male, and it's a story that shows the power of mentoring, I think. So I said you could ask any questions in the middle of it, but I think I've just kept on talking. Yes, Eric? Did you?
Oh, sorry, I was just putting my pen back onto my...
Oh. I'm happy to answer any questions.
So I have a question. Thank you, first of all, for your very interesting talk. What happened, I've already forgotten his name, but to the brother who founded this whole community?
To Leonard Feeney, Father Leonard Feeney. So he was
Yes.
reconciled. He was reconciled with the Catholic Church around 1972, after Sister Catherine died. He, by then, was frail. He was born, he was about 75 years old. He never recanted his point of view that you had to be Catholic to be saved, nor did the Catholic Church ask him to do that. He simply, the church wanted to, end this war between the two organizations. And then he died in 1978. So he was about 80 years old when he died. And obviously Catherine Clark, Sister Catherine, died ahead of that.
And do you know, probably not, but I was wondering what the relationship between the two of them was, Sister Catherine and Father Feeney.
Well, it was certainly nothing more than platonic, but I will tell you, Sister Catherine became the force. First, she was the power behind the throne, and then she was the throne. And by the time we moved to Still River, Father Feeney was playing a subservient role to her. And it was very evident to me, and even as a child, she was the power. And I write quite a bit about that. There are others, apparently, and I was not privy to this, but others who have written about it said that they were often at odds. And it was Sister Catherine's way, or the highway. It was her mission I mean, Father went along with it, but he failed to keep up intellectually and managerially with her.
Patricia, there's a few questions in the chat as well. Kit asked also about Feeney, and then also how was the adjustment of leaving for you and your family?
Well, for me, leaving first, it was really almost as though I was an alien. You know, when we lived together, we had no television, no radio, no newspapers, never looked at a magazine, never eaten in a restaurant. I didn't know who Frank Sinatra was. I didn't know who Elizabeth Taylor was. I couldn't even, I mean, I knew the Red Sox were a baseball team in Boston, but I knew nothing about any of the players. I'd never heard a swear word. I'd never heard a slang word. So I walk out and, you know, I just can't even speak because I'm afraid to say anything. So for probably a year and a half, I like to describe myself as eyes wide open, ears wide open, and mouth shut. And it took some real getting used to. But the fact of the matter is, I had been taught that everybody was evil out in the world. And one of the first discoveries I made was that people were not evil. And in fact, I had to revamp my entire view of the world. And that was very encouraging because at least I knew that I could make friends and they were good people. I will tell you, Sister Catherine never reached out to me after I left. She was my godmother. And as far as she was concerned, she was rid of me. And that was the way it was there. And that was often the way it is in a cult. That was another indication to me that this was a cult. You kicked someone out and they might as well be dead. And for me, that was very hard because these were the only people I knew in the world. And I kept thinking, they're all going to hate me. And I didn't even have anyone else to turn to who loved me. So it was stressful, but I feel very, very lucky that I really have a resilient nature. And it wasn't too long before I got a job. And I think that's part of the reason telling the story, which the working title at the moment is Breaking Glass. And I think it's a wonderful tribute to so many people who were willing to spend time and help me. Not that I could let them know. I kept my backstory a secret. I had only told 3 people in the world when I went to write my book at the age of 60. But once I got established in my career, I didn't feel, threatened. But, you can imagine when I was much younger, if people said, well, where did you grow up? And somebody says, I grew up in Toledo, Ohio. And where did you go to school? I went to, University of Virginia, whatever. My story wasn't like that. And so I was always fearful that people would ask me, where did you grow up? What did your father do? And so for years, I just kind of ran away from any engagement with anyone about my background. And so there were so many friends, really long friends, 30-year friends, 40-year friends, when my book came out, and they said to me, what? How come I never knew any of this? And I just kept it as such a secret. Fortunately, when my parents left, when you can just see from that picture there, they look as worldly and sophisticated and wonderful, and they were. For 20 years, they left the world, but when they came back into it, it was as though nothing had changed. And so, they were the most open and open-minded, and their house was always open because those other children that were leaving the center didn't all have the same family situation. And so our parents just let everybody come into their house. And so they were, the most worldly and yet really very, very Catholic people. That picture for their 25th wedding anniversary, we gave them a trip to Europe. And they wanted to go and see all of the great monasteries and cathedrals. And literally for the next 35 years together, they went almost every year to Europe, sometimes just revisiting some of the great sites. But they were very simpatico in their love of Catholicism and their love of European Christianity, is I guess the best way of putting it.
There's also a couple of questions from Sue. She asks, where were you schooled, high school? Did you feel different from the other students? And then also asks if you're close to your siblings or if you talk about that period of time with them.
Yes, we were schooled within our community. I never set foot in a public school or any school outside of our own. So there were 39 children, and you can imagine when you have a 10 years range in age. My class was I was one of 5. And so it was a very classical education. I had 6 years of Latin. I think one of the reasons I got into Vassar was that I took Latin as one of my achievement tests, and I was in the 99th percentile. I took Greek. We took chemistry. Interestingly, we did not take biology. And so another reason for why I was lacking in some knowledge. And I remember thinking later when I had my children, and I was 45 when I had my twins, and I remember thinking at some point they were heading into high school, I go, oh, this is going to be my opportunity to learn biology. Well, it didn't happen. Somehow they're doing their homework in the 9th grade, and I'm not quite, saying, oh, I'll learn all about biology. But I really feel as though there's a gap in my education about, I've never dissected a frog, all those things. Not that I would have necessarily wanted to do that. But we were, I don't want to call it homeschooled because there were tutors. Truth be told, I think our school could have even been better. But because they could have had my father teaching mathematics. They could have had Charlie Iwaskio teaching physics. But Sister Catherine made sure that only the females, only the big sisters were the teachers. But I have some wonderful stories about my English teacher. There was only one African American at the center. And she graduated from Radcliffe in 3 years at the age of 19 and went on and got her graduate degree in education at the age of 21. And she was teaching in East Boston. And one of her students introduced her to the center. And she became our English teacher in high school. And she and I remained in close touch. She died about 5 years ago at the age of 90. And for me, the education I got from her in English in high school has stayed with me for my whole life. So the education was within the school, so there wasn't any ability for me to compare. Am I close to my siblings? Today, we are very, very close. We probably, all 5 of us, probably get together 3 or 4 times a year. It's been difficult. We would be having Thanksgiving up in Rhode Island, but we can't do that with coronavirus. We are immensely close, which is wonderful.
Did anybody else have any questions? Patricia, I was going to ask you, I don't know if I misheard you. Did you reference that you had started writing this book at 16?
Oh, no, at 60.
Oh, at 60. Oh. Okay. I was going to ask how long, like what your writing process looked like, or...
Well, it took me 10 years to write that book. I'm not letting it take me 10 years to write the one I'm writing now. In fact, my publisher, who's looking forward to publishing it, said if I could get it out by spring, he would be really pleased. So I'm working very, very hard to do that. But it did take me 10 years for several reasons. One, I had to learn the craft of writing. I had a career on Wall Street, and there you don't do creative writing. So I went to memoir writing classes that were in Westport, called the Westport Writers Workshop. And it was fantastic for me in so many ways because there were about 6 women in my class. And each week we would write something. And so I just kept writing my story. And they were so fantastic because I said, well, I'm really fearful about writing this book because I don't want people to hate my parents. And they said, no, 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 we don't hate your parents. We don't understand why they did what they did, but we don't hate your parents. We know whom we hate. But so for that was so helpful to me. But then to learn the craft of writing was so important. I will admit that there were times when and I still can have that even writing my second book, I feel as though there's just a boulder in front of me. And I don't know, I can't get around it. It's just like a block. I can't write. And then other times I wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and go, oh, no, I want to write. I want to write. And I would just want it to never stop. I'm sure that happens with writers, but maybe more with me. There were things I did not want to tell in my book. I didn't want to ever tell that story that there was a big Punisher. And at a certain point I said, Patricia, if you don't tell that, your book's not the truth. You have to, fess up. And so I did that, but that took a lot. But there is one story, and some people have said to me, well, it must have been very cathartic to write the book. I didn't feel it was. One of the reasons I said to my parents that I wanted to write it is I said 50 years from now, there'll be no more eyewitnesses. And so, people can tell the story, oh, that's what those people were all about. Now, I say that I was one of 39 children. There are 39 stories. I could only write my own, but I know that it holds much of the truth for many of them. So, but there were times when I had difficulty, and there were times I would actually cry. It was just the emotion of getting into writing so much about things that had been painful or whatever. But there was one story I did not tell. And when my agent and I were having lunch one day, I think he wanted a little more sex, if you will, in the book. And I'll just put it that way, because I was pretty tight-lipped. And then I told him a story. And he said to me, if you can write that story, write it. And then if you want to take it out, we won't publish it. And it was a Me Too story of something that happened to me, not in the center. There was physical abuse at the center. There was not sexual abuse. But there was a broker in my office. And he invited me out to have a drink. He invited people all the time. I was going to school at night. And I thought to myself, I can have maybe one beer and then I'll run off to school. He had a plan and he executed on it. And he put something in my drink and I woke up hours later in my bed, naked, and he was getting out of my bed. And I blamed myself. To this day, now I know what happened. But for years I blamed myself. I didn't tell my parents for 30 years. And I told my agent that story, and that's what he said, in this case, see if you write it. This was before Harvey Weinstein. I thought I was 1 in 5 million people. Once I had written the story, I said, it can stay. And so it's the last story I wrote. It was the only one that probably was cathartic. I still will admit not liking the notion of people reading it, but the fact of the matter is I've now discovered that I wasn't 1 in 5 million. I was probably 1 in 5. But it was for me, so shocking. And I did blame myself. And I did not put his name in the book because I know he has children. He's probably dead now. He would be in his 90s, I think. And he was, 20 years older than I. But he, I think, it was best for me to change names, and because I think he had a son with his name, and I would certainly never want that visited on his own child. So, so the process of writing has now become really, really fun for me. I'm fortunate enough to be a columnist for one of the local papers here, the Greenwich Sentinel. So I write lots of kind of really blog kinds of things. I do write on politics. I chose not to write on politics this season And I may never write on politics again. I think it's a safer way to exist. But I think you can weave, you know, decision-making and economics, which I do understand and know, in a way that doesn't necessarily cause too much friction. So, but I wrote a piece about Ruth Bader Ginsburg after she died. I wrote about election day. You know, John and I thought we were smart and we were going to go vote first thing that morning, and it was 37 degrees and my fingers were like icicles. And I had to stand for 40 minutes before I could get in. And I went, well, this is a really fantastic situation. If this many people are voting, this is good. You know, regardless of how they're voting, people are at least, you know, voting. As my grandmother used to say to me, if you don't vote, you can't complain. So I did write a blog about that. But now I'm really have to put a lot of my energies into finishing my second book. And I've probably taken more of your time than you all wanted. I hope if you haven't read the book, I do have a website, which is patriciachadwick.com. And I've done other things. I was fortunate enough to be on CBS morning show last Saturday. And that will very shortly be there. And my book is an audiobook. It's on Kindle. It's soft cover now. And so, you know, I hope that you'll enjoy it. And if you haven't read it yet.
Thank you so much, Patricia. And I wanted to say too, I will, I send follow-up emails after these things so I can link to your book. And I'll send out the recording of the program once I've processed it and all of that. But I'll link to your website and to your book.
I got all that part when I was trying to learn how to put the slides on, right?
We got there.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. I hope it was enjoyable.
Very much so.
Great.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you for making it. All right.
I'll stop that. Okay. So now I can just leave this way. All right. Thanks, Eric, so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, this was a really great talk. I'm really glad that.
Great to be with you. Thank you so much.
Okay, Kathy, thank you.